Welcome to our next psychological health talk. Today we're going to talk about exercise and its impact on the diagnosis of depression. Exercise can have impact on other kinds of mental health issues also, but I want to talk about a couple of very specific ways that exercise and depression interact. And so we're going to talk about two studies today. It's going to be a little bit on the technical side. So I'm going to assume that most of you have not taken neuroanatomy classes. We're going to spend some time talking about the structure of the brain and how the brain is affected by depression and how that's rectified. And we'll begin to see as we do that how different kinds of exercise and movement have a major impact on how depression works. We're going to start by just talking a little bit about why does depression exist? We have kind of an assumption in our current medical situation that depression is a disorder. I'm going to talk a little bit about when that becomes true and when that isn't. But the reality is that there have been reports of depressed moods throughout human history. It is also something that we find is occurring quite regularly in modern society. When something has existed over that length of time, over recorded human history, we're looking at 4,000 to 5,000 years at the minimum, and identifications of this kind of mood state over that length of time. My assumption is when something exists for that length of time, it isn't simply because something is out of order. It's because in some way or another, there's some part of that has been helpful for human beings in their survival that has made it possible for us to have the capacity to feel depression. Now, that's not the same thing as when depression gets stuck, and we'll talk about that in just a second. What I'd like to suggest is that most of the time, when we feel what we call a depressed mood, it's in reaction to a loss of something significant. So the most common time that we see that kind of emotional reaction is when somebody really close to us dies. And that loss has an impact on us, and the impact is to deeply feel that loss. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that does as we go into this a little bit. Other kinds of mood downers, for want of a better term, times when our mood takes a dip, are oftentimes in reaction to other kinds of loss. So a breakup of an important relationship, the loss of financial stability or something like that. It is during those times that one of the challenges that a loss like that presents to us is, first of all, to honor, in the case of somebody who we loved, who died, to honor the memory of that person. In the case of the breakup of a relationship, it might be to understand what happened and recognize the mistakes that we might have made during that relationship, so that we can correct those mistakes and be able to not repeat them in the future. Ultimately, when we're in a lower mood, one of the things we're doing is we're paying attention to what's really important in life. So the loss reminds us that things are not permanent in this world. Things are always changing. And it's important for us to pay attention to what's actually important, so that that becomes the thing that we put our effort and time into. So when I have somebody that I love very dearly that dies, one of the reminders for that is I need to make sure that I'm paying attention to the things that are really important. And I then might be willing to say, okay, I need to pay more attention to the people in my life that are alive that are really important, and make sure that I make time for them, because this loss reminds me that that time isn't forever. Now that's important. The diagnosis of a depressive disorder occurs not because we get sad like that, but because sometimes that sadness gets stuck. And when it gets stuck and we can't get out of it, that's when we need to have an effective treatment for it. We need to be able to do something to get us unstuck. So somebody suffers the loss of somebody who's really important to them. They get sad, they grieve, and then it gets stuck. And all of life seems like it's unimportant. And nothing gives them pleasure anymore. And they isolate themselves, and they get into a pattern of not interacting with people that are important to them. That kind of stuckness needs to be treated so that we can fulfill what's actually important about working through a loss. We can learn from that loss. We can rededicate ourselves to what's really important, and we can go on with our life. So that in the case of losing somebody that we really love, part of the honoring of their memory is to take what they have given us and make sure that in our actions we're offering that same kind of love, kindness, interaction to others around us. So that's why depression exists, and that's why sometimes when it gets stuck, we need to treat it. So we're going to talk about not the kind of thing that we always have to do in every situation, because it's a complex diagnosis when somebody gets stuck. But we're going to talk about some things that do make a difference, and in addition to other kinds of treatments, can help a person to really get unstuck from a period of depression that is hard to get out of. So in order to do that, I first of all have to take you through some neuroanatomy. So one of the things that you would learn if you take a basic neuroanatomy class is that the brain is organized with individual nerve cells. Those individual nerve cells essentially have a cell body, which is the middle of it. They have a dendrite and an axon. There won't be a test on this, so you don't have to remember all of these terms. But the dendritic area is the place where this nerve cell receives signals from another nerve cell. And the axon is the place where those nerve cells then send out signals to the neighboring cells. It's much more complex than that, but that's sufficient for what we're going to be talking about today. One of the things that's unique about it, though, and that's important, is that each nerve cell actually doesn't touch the nerve cells around it. There's a little bit of a gap between the dendrite and the axon, so that the nerve cells, somebody once joked, it's kind of like a Puritan cell. It doesn't actually touch anyone else, but because of that, there's a release of chemical into what's called a synaptic cleft. Again, there's not a test on it. You don't have to remember the title. that chemical is then in between the axon and the dendrite, and then it's picked up by the other cell and processed through the cell body. And that's how cells communicate. So one of the medication treatments, there have been several of them, but one of the medication treatments for depression is something called a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. We have very long names for these things. What this does is it kind of outlines, this particular slide outlines that serotonin hypothesis. So the first of the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors was a drug called Prozac. Still on the market these days. It was introduced in the mid-'80s. And many of the antidepressants that have come since then have been refinements of the original medication, the original Prozac medication. But the basic mechanism is the same. So the hypothesis was that there's an inadequate amount of serotonin in the system, and the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors work by serotonin is released from the initial cell, it's blocked from being absorbed into the new cell, so it goes from the axon into the synaptic cleft. There's a block that's occurring in the dendrite so that the serotonin stays in the gap between the two cells for a longer period of time, and that allows more serotonin to accumulate before it's absorbed into the new cell. And so the kind of initial hypothesis was that that the fact that there's more serotonin available that gets absorbed, therefore what we see in depression is that depression is basically a serotonin disease. Turns out that there's a problem with that. The first indication of that is that when people took a serotonin supplement, it didn't have the same impact as the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. We've known this inadequacy for this hypothesis for certainly since the late 80s. It was something that we discovered pretty quickly, but there wasn't another hypothesis to replace it. And in order to explain the mechanism of how an antidepressant worked, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, the serotonin hypothesis, was a simple way to explain it to people, even though it was inadequate to explain what's really going on. So what I want to do is move from this serotonin hypothesis to a new insight that is relatively new, within the last 10 years, based on a study that was done at the Medical College of Wisconsin, which is right down the road from where we are, where I'm recording this. So the study in the Medical College was looking at not how we replace serotonin, but is there something unique about the blocking of the reuptake of serotonin, causing it to stay in the synaptic cleft for a little bit longer period of time, that makes the cell change in reaction to this medication. One of the things that we do know is that when you're depressed, and particularly if that depression gets stuck, it creates some damage to the cell body. And that's why people will say when they're depressed that they don't have energy, that they can't seem to get themselves to do things. The cell is actually operating on low power and needs to be repaired in order to function appropriately. Well, one of the things that the study at the medical college suggested, and this is still hypothesis, but it makes more sense to me, is that part of what happens with this process where the serotonin is blocked, you've got more serotonin in the synaptic cleft, that increases the binding to the postsynaptic receptors. And what the serotonin then seems to do is it opens a little bit of a gate. It's called permeability of the cell. It opens a little bit of a gate to allow another substance to get in. That substance is called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. We abbreviate it BDNF because nobody wants to say brain-derived neurotrophic factor all the time. The BDNF, when it's allowed inside the cell body, functions a little bit like a repair crew. It starts to repair the damage of the cell that has been done through the depression, restoring it so that it can function normally again. That might be one of the reasons why an antidepressant doesn't work right away. Because in the same way that if you were going to remodel your kitchen and you had a bunch of workmen come in, that doesn't happen instantaneously. They have to tear out the things in the kitchen that need replacing. They have to redo things. They have to put everything back together in order to have a new functioning, very modern kitchen. Well, the same kind of thing may be happening with this BDNF. It gets into the cell. It takes some time to repair the damage that was done by the depression. Typically, people don't notice an effect of a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor for somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks. That may be when the BDNF is repairing the cell. And when the cell is fully repaired, then it can function more normally again, and a person can let go of the depressed mood and begin to work in their life in a way that is similar to the way they were before they became depressed. Well, if all of that is true, it gives us a kind of a clue to something. So we've known for a very long time that aerobic exercise can be as effective as an antidepressant, especially for mild to moderate depression. When we get into more severe depression, we may need a medication to get that whole process started and make sure that it's on track. But if you're engaged in aerobic exercise, you are getting an antidepressant effect. Well, what is the main source of producing BDNF in our bodies? Turns out it's aerobic exercise. So when we're moving, getting ourselves, we're engaged in some kind of movement, we're engaged in some kind of activity, and we break that light sweat. One of the chemical reactions that's going on in our body is we're producing more brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And so one of the things that means is that moderate exercise is then creating an environment in which there's more BDNF available. If there's more BDNF available, it's easier to get it into the cell. Therefore, the cell can get repaired, and the person can be restored to regular function. The implication of that, of course, is that if I'm engaged in regular aerobic exercise, it helps me to keep a ready supply of BDNF in my system, which is likely going to keep my cells healthier all the time, so that when I do become sad, it's less likely to get stuck. Now, this is a challenge, because when I'm depressed, I don't necessarily feel like exercising. We've known for a very long time, since before the first SSRI, or the first selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, that an effective behavioral change that will create a change in a person's depressed mood is to get them out of bed, get them out of their room, get them engaged in activity again. And now with this information from the medical college, it makes sense that regular activity then becomes a source of BDNF, which is a source of repairing the cells, keeping those cells healthy. One of the things that implies is that even if I'm taking an antidepressant, and there are times when that's clearly necessary because the cell has been damaged enough that we need a medication to jumpstart that process, to get those cells ready to receive the BDNF inside, to repair those cells and get them working well again, which again is a reason why if you're taking an antidepressant, you probably need to stay on it for 9 to 12 months at the minimum, so that the cells can become completely repaired and completely healthy. Works better if there's also a lifestyle change. Works better if we also engage in regular physical activity. And we're not talking about marathon running. We're not talking about somebody having to spend hours in the gym. We're talking about the kind of exercise that occurs until we break that light sweat. That'll change a little bit for different people. As you get better in condition, that light sweat comes a little later in the exercise process. But it might be that you're breaking that light sweat because you're engaged in some yard work. It might be that you're getting that light sweat because you're walking at a pace that causes your heart rate to get up just enough to really engage. And all of that is starting that process of getting that BDNF produced and will help you to stay healthier. So there's a very clear connection between medication, the medication that repairs those cells, and the exercise that can help with that. If you want to be healthiest, you want to pair any kind of medication treatment with other kinds of lifestyle changes that will help you to become healthy faster and stay healthy longer. Now there's a second element. So we've been talking about individual cells, and depression clearly interacts with individual cells. What I'm going to do is take us now to another theory, and this one is a theory that was put forth by a neuroscientist by the name of Kelly Lambert. One of the things that she did that was different than others before her is she moved from looking at how each cell is affected to looking at the systems of intercommunication within the brain. So that the brain is regularly cross-communicating. So nerve cells in the center of my brain are sending out signals to the front of my brain where the thinking centers are, the top of my brain where motor cortex is involved is engaging for complex movements. We have all these systems that are going along. One of the things that she recognized is that those systems, when we are depressed, have kind of a regular pattern to them. So that this central part here, the limbic system, is a part where we generate emotions. And so if I'm feeling sad, if I'm feeling depressed, the limbic system is going to be active as part of the way the brain is processing those emotions. The prefrontal cortex out there in the front of the brain, that's behind the forehead here, is the part of the brain that's responsible for thinking. And one of the things that happens is that because the limbic system works faster than the prefrontal cortex, the emotions are kind of affecting the way that we think. And that's why when a person gets depressed, they start thinking negatively. They think negatively about themselves, they think negatively about the environment they're in, they think negatively about their past, they think negatively about their future. All of that is driven in this connection between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. We've known that process for a long time as well. One of the interesting insights that Kelly Lambert came up with is that there's a third system that gets engaged, and in order to understand that, we have to look at some statistics. So then, if we look at the statistics for people who were born in the 1920s, old people now, many of them very old, and we look at the rates of depression that were diagnosed during that time, and people were diagnosed with depression at that time, to people who were born in the middle part of the 20th century, 1950 and above. One of the things that we see is that the diagnosis of depression has skyrocketed in that 30 to 40 year period, so that there's 10 times as much depression diagnosed in people who were born later in the middle of the 20th century, that would be people in my generation, than people who were born earlier. Some of that is because we diagnose more, because we're more aware. But that wouldn't account for all of that rapid change. And so one of the things that Kelly Lambert observed was that that was true early part of the 20th century, middle part of the 20th century, a 10 times higher rate of depression in virtually all groups in Western society except for the Amish. And the thing that she noticed was the Amish way of life hadn't changed very much throughout that entire century. So that the Amish were still doing lots of physical work, and we're going to talk a little bit about a specific type of physical work in a second. But one of the things that helped her to see was that there's a third section, the top of the brain, here labeled cortex, but we're talking about the motor cortex, also has a projection, and the three meet right about here in something called the nucleus accumbens. And when we are engaged in a particular kind of movement, that movement quiets down the limbic system and makes it less likely that the limbic system is going to take over. In other words, it means it's less likely that we're going to get stuck in depression. What happened in the latter half of the 20th century? We got lots of labor-saving devices, so that your ability to wash dishes has changed. You put them in the dishwasher most of the time. Your ability to prepare food, you order DoorDash. I hope not too often, but we do that. What she noticed was that there was a particular benefit to repetitive hand movements that came out of this parietal area, this motor cortex, that met in that nucleus accumbens, that helped to quiet the intensity of the emotions that we were feeling. So chopping vegetables, preparing food like that, doing sewing with actual hand movements instead of with a sewing machine, writing longhand rather than typing on a keyboard. All of those things activate this pathway that helps to quiet the emotions, so that it turns out that repetitive hand movements actually make a difference. And so one of the implications of that if you're deciding you're going to eat better, one of the things you might do is prepare food that is organic and more natural. If you're going to do that, you're going to spend more time chopping vegetables because it's not pre-prepared. That chopping vegetables actually will help you to be less depressed. Is it possible that some of the repetitive movements that we use to quiet babies, we rock them, we bounce them up and down, does that help to quiet the emotional states? So don't underestimate these two things. The value of aerobic exercise, the value of repetitive hand movements to help you to get those sad feelings to be unstuck. Now that doesn't mean you'll never feel sad, because it's important. It helps us to remind us to pay attention to what's really important. But it helps us to keep from getting stuck. Lifestyle changes are an essential part of any treatment. But in these two cases, an essential part of recovering from a depressed disorder and staying healthy over a longer period of time. So that's what we're going to talk about for today. Please take time to like this presentation if it seems to make sense to you. Keep coming back to us and joining us on our YouTube channel as we continue to explore the value of the psychological health that we can uncover. Thank you. Talk to you again next week.